It turns out that in order to turn that theory into something that is useful for us, we often need to use computers to help model a situation. And so we take theories, we put numbers in there of what we know, what we think might happen. We get some numbers out, which tells us how this experiment might go. And then we do the experiment. And now we use computers again to help us sort out all that data and compare it to what we think might have happened, before we started the experiment. And so I think computers are increasingly important to, one, both create models to validate theories and also help us collect data and compare them to what we thought was going to happen.
In this episode, we dive into the fascinating world of scientific computing with Mark, who has a background in computational biology. He shares insight into his career journey and the critical role of scientific computing in modern research. Scientific computing involves leveraging computers to analyze and interpret experimental data, bridging the gap between theoretical models and real-world outcomes. Despite his non-computer science background, Mark assists colleagues in biology and other fields with computational tasks, emphasizing the importance of data interpretation. He takes us through his journey experimenting with various programming languages before discovering Julia, which he now prefers for its efficiency and ease of use, especially in scientific applications. Mark illustrates the benefits of Julia with the specific challenge he faced, managing data from 10 cameras in a very specific microscope, showcasing how Julia provided the solution by being able to parse gigabytes of data per second. We also explore the vibrant community around Julia and the upcoming JuliaCon conference, highlighting the inclusive nature of the community and the opportunities for collaboration and growth. So join us as we uncover the pivotal role of scientific computing in modern research and the advantages of using Julia for computational tasks in biology and beyond. Welcome to Inspiring Computing. This podcast is where computing meets the real world. Inspiring Computing aims to trigger your curiosity by talking to proficient and advanced MATLAB, Python, and Julia users who use these tools to deepen their understanding of the world around them by simulating it, exploring trade-offs, and gaining insights that help their companies add more value. In addition to proficient users, we will be talking to product marketing, toolbox authors, package developers, and library maintainers to see what drives their development and what issues they're solving for others to benefit from. Welcome, Mark, to Inspiring Computing.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So I heard about you because your name is very popular and very well known inside the Julia community. So I looked you up and I was pleasantly surprised of how inspiring your background story is, where you're involved in a whole bunch of things around Julia conferences, maintaining Julia packages, but you also work at this very interesting place called Howard Hughes Medical Institute. But before you dive into all of that, maybe you can tell me a little bit about yourself, Mark.
Sure. So I'm at HHMI, and first I should clarify that I'm not speaking on behalf of HHMI in this capacity. So I'm just speaking about me personally and about my personal journey here. My training has been as a biologist, a computational biologist. I have a PhD from the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center in molecular biophysics. And yeah, my bachelor's degrees were in mathematics and chemistry. I like physical sciences. I like the biological sciences. And I also like computing. And throughout that journey of learning science and becoming a researcher and doing all that training, I learned that actually the thing that gets me up at night, that motivates me, is doing scientific computing. And so that's how I eventually came here to the Geneva Research Campus of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, is to do scientific computing, because I found that's a part of science and research that I really like.
So maybe just to clarify, so scientific computing, what does that actually mean, or what does it mean to you?
Yeah, I think it can mean a lot of things and different things to different people. But generally, we're trying to use computers to help us understand the science. We're trying to use all this computing power to go through all the data that we're collecting from either microscopes or electrophysiology experiments or any kind of data that we're getting. And we're trying to make sense of it all, right? And how are we going to do that? And it turns out the computers are a great tool that we have at our disposal, and we're trying to figure out how to use that efficiently.
So when I was at high school, they always taught me, when it talks about science, that a scientific way of working is you do experiments, you try things, trial and error, you validate your assumptions along the way. But an experiment is a part of learning and understanding the real world. And then there was another part, which was my classes full of theory, right? So we would write down equations and our math teacher would explain the world with some kind of formulas. So are you focusing on a third pillar? Is that what scientific computing is?
I think I'm somewhere in between. I'm trying to make all that stuff you just talked about work together, right? There's this whole notion of a scientific process where we have a theory, and from that we maybe have a very specific hypothesis about how the experiment is supposed to go. And at some point, and that theory could be really vague. Okay, the apple is going to fall down from the tree, but then we might start putting some numbers on it, right? It's going to fall down at 9.8 meters per second squared, right? And so that's an acceleration factor. And now we're starting to put real numbers onto what's going to happen. And eventually this theory becomes very specific, right? It becomes that we're making predictions about what's going to happen in the world around us or with certain kinds of numbers that we're collecting. And it turns out that in order to turn that theory into something that is used for us, we often need to use computers to help model a situation. And so we take theories, we put numbers in there of what we know, what we think might happen. We get some numbers out, which tells us how this experiment might go. And then we do the experiment. And now we use computers again to help us sort out all that data and compare it to what we think might have happened, before we started the experiment. And so I think computers are increasingly important to, one, both create models to validate theories and also help us collect data and compare them to what we thought was going to happen.
Right. But your background, you didn't study computer science, right? So you have a domain expertise in biology and chemistry. I'm assuming that computers is not where you studied the most. It's more like an essential necessity. And I'm assuming you're surrounded by domain experts, which potentially are not such good programmers. So could you maybe share a story of how someone is actually using a microscope that you called out, for example? What does a day in a life of someone working next to you look like? And how do you help those people with the computational part of things?
Yeah, absolutely. Most of the people around me are trained, much like I just described for myself, right? They have a PhD or advanced degree in some kind of scientific field. They're trained to be a biologist, a physicist, an optical engineer, not necessarily a computer scientist. And I think over time, I've learned that being a computer scientist is also something a little bit different than being a computer programmer, right? So I'm not trying to build an operating system kernel and go into the abstract nature of types. So the people around me, right, they are typically trained to be a biologist, and they are trying to understand how life works. They want to understand how a particular organism functions, either to understand how that organism is responding to stimuli, how their brains work, how their nerves work, how their muscles respond to the brain, and so forth, or how does computer vision work, or natural vision work. These are things that they're trying to understand. And so sitting here, they have a question like, Mark, are these little contact sites, these little protein complexes of cells that I'm looking at, are these evenly spaced? For example, this is a question that was just brought to me by my colleague Lorena. And Lorena was trying to figure out, is this signal that I acquired by tracing through these images? And that's a fairly complicated question. And depending on kind of the context, as a mathematician, that means something very specific. But to a biologist, this might mean something a little bit different, right? Because it might mean, are these evenly spaced? And then I have to compensate for all the variability that you get for biology. Yet, despite this variability, it still works somehow, right? You still get a living organism that's able to swim around or walk around. And so what we're trying to do is figure out how all of that works. And what I try to help my colleagues with is they get data, and then eventually that data becomes numbers. And I try to help them interpret those numbers.
And so when you say interpret those numbers, are you using a specific language in play? So is this where Julia comes into play, or do you use a wide portfolio of programming languages and tools, and you use Julia for yourself and then share insights with others? Walk me through a little bit about your tech stack.
No, absolutely. I think this goes through different kinds of layers, right? Because for biologists, they typically they like to not get into nitty gritty of the ones and zeros of the program, but they just want to be able to look at their data. And often the data starts in the form of either tip images or perhaps CSV files or maybe even Excel files, right? And they may be able to generate an initial plot in Excel or they use a Java program like MSJ to look at a picture initially. And so that's definitely the very beginning of my stack, right? So there's a little bit of Java in there. There's a little bit of maybe using Microsoft Office tools to figure out how to export the data. But then increasingly, it's been more and more Julia because it hits the sweet spot of what I want to do. I think many of my colleagues do use Python, and I think that works for them. But where I often feel a little bit of friction was trying to use Python for some of these applications that I like to do a lot of math with. For example, when my colleague comes and asks me is something periodic, or something we might immediately want to do is something called a Fourier transform, which basically starts to break a signal into sine waves and cosine waves, which are things that are fundamentally periodic. And it turns out in the mathematics that we know that a periodic signal must be composed of these smaller components of sine waves and cosine waves. And I've just found increasingly that Julia allows me to very quickly get to the mathematics without having to get into a bunch of other things that I don't want to have to worry about, right? And so I think Julia's package management is fantastic. Its compilation and speed allows me to quickly get the answers that I want and get back to the biologist. Like, yeah, I think this might be periodic, or no, we need to take a little bit of a different approach. There's too much variability here. And we're asking the wrong questions.
So based on your answer and your experience, I'm assuming that you've actually seen a wide portfolio of technologies, right? So I'm assuming
Absolutely.
that Julia was not the first language you picked up. And you mentioned Python, and I'm sure you're aware there's lots of specific libraries that can help you in the Python ecosystem. But there's also other languages like maybe MATLAB. So can you tell me a bit of your experience in each of these languages, and to dive a little bit deeper on why you find Julia hitting that sweet spot?
Yeah, sure. I think I did quite a survey of languages. It depends how far you want to go back. I always try to go back to the practical beginning, right? Back when I was in high school, it's actually maybe middle school, right? That I actually started looking at web browser and trying to understand how things were working there. And I started with technologies like HTML and JavaScript, and eventually got into Java. And I was really inspired by this kind of network, internet first functionality, but also back then really getting impressed by that I could just download something for free and run something, right? So this kind of open source nature of languages. Because before that, I remember being as a little kid trying to figure out how do I get into this, because I found computers really interesting. And thinking like, I need $100 to go buy Microsoft Visual Studio at the, some box at the store or World in C++. And I wasn't sure that I wanted to make that kind of investment. But suddenly these things started to come along and I could just download things and they would let me program. And this is very different than, say, my dad's generation where, maybe we had some old TRS-80 and we had to use something basic and we were copying codes from a magazine to that. And I think I recall doing that as a young kid, but I was really now enamored with how the world was starting to change with the internet. And I think fast forwarding a little bit, I kept doing a little bit of web development. That was something that was still accessible to me and throughout college. But we started getting into some new things there. I got some experience with Scheme. This was like the one computer science course I actually took was an honors intro to comp sci course. And they used the MIT course and taught a list variant called Scheme. And that kind of really made me start thinking about the structure of computer programs. I think the book it's called SICP, Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs, from the traditional MIT course. But these were still not super practical things. This is really abstract. If anything, I was getting more into web technology. I started using Ruby and Rails to do some web development for Model UN Club I got involved in. But it wasn't until I got to graduate school when I was doing my PhD in Dallas, Texas at UT Southwestern. This is basically a medical school. And I was doing my role research in synthetic biology at the time. So the first thing I used there was actually R. I remember looking around a few different things. I felt like Python was maybe a little bit too new then, but R seemed to have it together. I could make plots. I could run quick simulations. That felt pretty good. That worked. I published my first academic paper with R. But then quickly, my work started to become a lot more about image processing. And I think this is when suddenly where something that knew about a matrix natively became really important. And so I started using MATLAB at that point. Part of that was that a lot of the code that came before me from others, from either my lab or my mentor's lab, like when he was a postdoc, he had all this code and it was all in MATLAB. And so I started using that. And that started changing my way of thinking a little bit. So thinking about for loops, you quickly learn in MATLAB that you should probably just think about matrix operations and whatnot, and all kinds of funny schemes to detect into matrices. And it was pretty good. I could do some computer vision. I could automatically threshold and detect bacteria and kind of make all kinds of measurements with that. But something was definitely felt off by the end of this process, because I would do all this research. I would publish this academic paper, and in there, I would want to describe what I did and how I did it. And I could definitely share my MATLAB code with it. But occasionally I would run into someone who couldn't access MATLAB for one reason or another, right? Either their institution wasn't paying for it and it would cost thousands of dollars or other things. And this kind of bugged me, but I had access to MATLAB and someone was paying for me. And for the moment, I kept using it, but I kept trying to think about how do I do my work in such a way that other people could also take advantage of it. And so I got really interested in technologies like, say, a MATLAB compiler and things like this, things that would let other people use my code so I could share it with others. And it was actually really helpful at the time that we had a few different academic labs working with the same language. And so we could share code between those labs. But it was becoming increasingly difficult to share code with people from outside of our universe. And I started looking at things like Python. I started actually teaching some Python here and there as different kinds of courses came up, and I was acting as a teaching assistant. I kept going back to MATLAB at that time because I wasn't feeling that this was very different or even better. It just seems maybe like a pre-alternative to the same thing, but not quite as polished of an experience. Basically, in principle, we were doing the same kinds of operations. We were loading data. We weren't really compiling our code. It was more still a scripting language in that we were gluing together larger bits of code together and using that to efficiently do our computations. And so I usually would, by the end of this, I was usually doing most of my primary work in MATLAB. And then maybe I would try to rewrite it in Python and see if I felt better about that code or if that helped someone else use some of my algorithms, although I would never do a complete translation. And so I kept doing research. I continued after I got my PhD to do research in a lab. I joined a lab that was doing more computer vision, and that was focused on single particle tracking. Eventually, I stumbled upon a problem of how to trace out filaments within a biological cell. And especially when you had really complex filaments of things intersecting, it turned out that computer vision was really well optimized for tracing out isolated roads that you could clearly mark out, or things that intersected at right angles. But when you had a really messy biological situation where things were going every which way, things got really complicated with these intersections. And so I needed to come up with new computational algorithms to figure out how do I detect these kinds of situations, tear these apart, turn these back into numbers, and then start thinking about what does that mean for the biology. And so I think by that point, I got to various places. I was near to California, San Diego for a while, finishing up my research. I finished. I started a postdoc back in Dallas at UT Southwestern again. I eventually went to Northwestern University at the Vineberg School of Medicine, where I was doing that last part that I just described of trying to use computer vision to understand the structure of filaments and how they were accumulating in a cell to protect the cell structure and its nucleus.
But this is still in MATLAB. This is still in MATLAB that you're working in?
It's still mostly MATLAB, right?
Yeah.
And then something funny happened. A few things converged, right? Because I was finishing up that work and I was starting to have a little bit of free time in my hands. So I started looking into something new that I saw way back in 2012, about this thing called Julia. And it sounded really attractive then, but it wasn't quite ready for me to use, I felt. But now it was 2020 and I had a little bit of time to learn about something new. So I started learning about Julia. I was getting pretty impressed. It was also around that time that I was trying to figure out what was I going to do when I grew up. I'm still at a university at this point at Northwestern in downtown Chicago, trying to figure out what was I going to do with my life. When you're in this kind of academic track, the natural thing is maybe to become a faculty member, to become a professor, continue. But increasingly, I was looking at what my mentors were doing, and it seemed like they're spending increasing amounts of time just writing grants and thinking about the next grant. And I was like, I actually like this computer programming part. I liked thinking about how computer programs worked and this data. And so I started looking for a job that would let me continue doing that and that maybe paid better than being an academic researcher. And eventually I found this job in scientific computing where I am now. And I think the best thing about this was that I now had a little bit of freedom to actually pick my tools and figure out how I was going to approach certain problems.
Hmm.
And so after getting into Julia a bit, I started trying to look for, is this something I could integrate into my tool set? And I think unlike Python, I felt like this was actually a little bit different from MATLAB now, because I wasn't just scripting, that this thing was actually generating native code like I used to do when my like high school C++ classes, right? And I thought that was really interesting. That was something that I had moved away from over time. Now this made it so easy to use. And that really started to seem like this was something new and distinct. And so now the question there was, what was the application of this? When I was initially hired into my current job, it's had to computing here. A lot of my advisors and superiors and predecessors had used a programming language called Java, which was, I think, actually one of those things I had used really early on. So that's how I was able to get the job, because I could prove that I still understood this. That changed a little bit since I last looked at it, but it was close enough that I could figure it out. But the one thing that kind of really bugged me a little bit after having used MATLAB and NumPy or Python or R is that the concept of kind of an image or like a matrix was still this very important thing in the language, right? We had to do all kinds of abstractions and tricks to do that. And I was calling get functions to retrieve XYZ coordinates from an image instead of using something more like a matrix indexing notation. But I actually did try to solve my problems in Java first. But while I was waiting for a code review to look at some changes I was suggesting, I had some time to get back into Julia. And I started observing that actually this was starting to solve a lot of my problems a lot more easily than anything else I had in my toolbox. So what was my problem then? My problem was that I was working with people, I still am working with these people, to help build new microscopes. And this is a problem that often involves really complicated scientific equipment. And just in particular, where my job started is at the detection device, at the camera. And so this is the device that will produce a lot of pictures in the forms of numbers and data very quickly. And so things I needed to figure out was how I was to deal with all these numbers. I needed to compress them, make the data smaller so that we could store them efficiently, because this is actually the limiting factor of how long you could use this instrument. The particular microscope I had was a pretty fancy thing called a light chain microscope, which allowed us to collect volumes, not just 2D images, but 3D images of fluorescent biological samples, a living zebrafish, for example, could be one of our targets. And we had multiplexed this so that there were now 10 cameras. So my problem was about 10 times larger than I'd ever dealt with before, because usually I had a single camera on the microscope, and now I have 10 of them. And the implication here was that we could only run this device for a total of 2 hours, maybe, before we filled the disk. Okay. And so there are several problems here. One is that I needed a way to experiment with a camera. I need to control this camera. And the drivers for this camera are only in C. Okay. They only run on Windows. So I had really restricted computational environment there. And yeah, frankly, trying to talk to the camera using Java was a little bit challenging, right? I think part of it was we were limited not to the maybe latest version of Java at the time, but And so we had very crude interfaces to work with native code. And so after I tried to do it in Java, then I went to try to do it in Julia, and I found this thing called ccall, right? Which basically allowed me to efficiently call the C functions that were documented in this API. And it had very little overhead. And I was just able to figure everything out about how the camera worked without having to jump through a bunch of hoops. And so I was super impressed by that. And then the next thing I needed was I needed to look at different compression schemes, but I really needed to get into the nuts and bolts of how this things worked. And so I eventually stumbled upon LZU4 and C standard. And I was trying to figure out how do I make sure that I can grab the data from a camera very quickly without making a bunch of copies, and then apply these compression algorithms in order to run this biological experiment a little bit longer, right? And I was a biologist as well before, and something that I know is that your biological subject doesn't always cooperate, right? You don't know that you're going to get all your data in this 2-hour window. It might take the whole day. And if I could give the biologist who's going to be using this microscope a little bit longer, 3 hours, 4 hours to figure things out, get the biology to work, and let them have the capability to capture that with this really fancy microscope that was trying to collect up to 500 frames per second with 10 cameras. You can do the math, and at pretty high resolution, we're talking about gigabytes per second. Okay, and this is going to fill up our things very quickly. And even we had a pretty good network connection as well. But even if we were transferring data off this thing, we would still be very limited by space and this time. And yeah, really impressed by the ability of Julia to really efficiently glue these things together and let me do this in real time without kind of a bunch of overhead. And so that was really impressive to begin with, right? I had tried to run some hardware with MATLAB before, and it's a little bit clunky, but yeah, I was able to really quickly get this with Julia. And so that's where I started to get hooked into this. The next thing I tried was, is this language going to work with all the other stuff I've been doing, right? Would it work with Java that my boss uses? He has a background. And so I got into a package called Java Call, which is .jl, which is a Julia package that lets you call into Java. And I tested that it worked. It had some rough edges. And so basically what then I tried to start figuring out is, why is this a little bit more difficult than usual? And I actually found an issue. There was a problem with the REPL, right? Julia has this great built-in concurrency system based on tasks, which allow you to write parallel programs without having to really manage operating system threads directly. It allows you to do things in parallel. But the way it does it is a little bit not traditional, that Java couldn't really understand exactly what was happening, where it tried to sort some things on a thread and he would end up being on another thread. And so Julia was doing something new, and this is slightly incompatible with Java. But the main thing was actually the Julia REPL, the kind of the prompt that allows you to put in one command of Julia at a time. And what I found was there's actually two tasks running in this. One was a background task that was evaluating your code, and there was a front-end task that was just reading your input. And so this would allow the REPL to be very responsive, that you could keep typing as it tried to do some computation. But it turns out the order of these things was reversed from what I needed it to be. I needed the background task, I think it was executing code, to be the first task, because that's what everything else outside of Julia would know what to do with.
Right, as expected.
It doesn't quite. Yes, exactly. And so, okay, I figured out the problem. This is a really technical thing. This means I had to get into the guts of Julia. I sat there, I kept looking at Julia code, and the greatest thing about Julia, in many ways, is that a lot of Julia is written in Julia. So I didn't have to remember a lot of C or C++, right? I was just reading it in pretty high-level syntax. That was Julia itself. And so I realized that I could make a change. I could flip around the order of these things.
Oh, in the language itself. So Julia itself, you could control that.
So at this point, I was really pretty well versed in open source, although not really used to making contributions to the core program itself. So this is a little bit of an adventure for me, to be honest, right? But I figured it out. I realized I needed to make the change to make this thing work better with Java. And so this is one of my very first pull requests to the Julia project. And basically I made it and I waited around for a few weeks. And eventually someone read it's like, yeah, we could do this. This totally makes sense. It was not just some random person. It was actually, I think, one of the founders, Jeff Possans and Sue, who wrote the PhD thesis that became Julia. And yeah, eventually this change made it in by, I think, Julia 1.3. And it helped not only me, but also a lot of other people who were trying to integrate other bits of software with Julia. And basically this meant that the code that you could run in a REPL would be running on the very first task. And it made it a lot easier to interoperate with other code that was also doing multi-threading or concurrency. And what really impressed me about this whole episode was that I was able to make a change to the core program, to Julia, to make it work better for me. I'd never done that with MATLAB because one, most of the code is proprietary. You can't see what's happening. And for the code that you can see, there's a whole bunch of copyright issues there.
Right.
When I did ask MathWorks to change something, they would do it, but it would take a while. It might not have been exactly the way I wanted it to have been done, or things like this. And maybe a similar thing with Python, right? I felt like things were pretty well established that it would be hard to change things without breaking other people's code that really depended on this. And so, yeah. So I think at that point, I was not completely sold because not only had this started really help me solve some really deep problems in terms of working with scientific hardware and crunching numbers really quickly and integrating a bunch of different kind of pieces of software, but I was also able to become part of the community, to start becoming someone who could modify how Julia itself worked. And so now I think I found that this is actually a really important aspect of my work environment that I wanted to have.
Wow. So this is a long journey that you've gone through, and it seems like you've overcome a bunch of obstacles, which, by the way you describe it, it feels like probably everybody around you probably hits and then probably just stops looking for the next solution, and they make peace with it, right? They say, okay, this is someone else's problem. I'll live with what I know, and then and you don't spend too much time evolving. But it feels like you're in a kind of a privileged situation where I think Howard Hughes Medical Institute, you're not necessarily driven by profit. You're not purely academic, but because you're a place where you're trying to do the right thing, it almost feels like you have time to explore things, removing certain constraints that maybe a more commercial organization might have or a more academic organization might have, that lends yourself to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there was definitely a little bit more time of not just figuring out how to do something in the quickest way possible, but there was a little bit more time to figure out, how do I do this right? Right? How do I come up with the best solution for this? Not necessarily the fastest solution that will let me publish a paper, which is the usual academic currency, because you need to publish a paper in order to get more grant money to repeat the cycle over and over again.
Right.
In this case, with HSMI, we're fortunate in that we have this large endowment that originated from the namesake Howard Hughes, but also a company called Hughes Aircraft that was part of the medical institute that they owned, and they sold off in order to create this endowment. And so they now use kind of the interest and from this endowment to fund medical research. And so we were no longer in a situation where I necessarily had to apply for grants, or where the people paying me had to apply for grants. And so we had a little bit of time to figure out, how can we do these bigger projects that would be very difficult for everyone else to do, right?
Right.
The system I described with the cameras, there's no way anyone else could justify that in a grant application.
Right.
This now brought me into a scale of things that no one else had really encountered before. We were trying to figure out, how do I solve these really difficult problems, and what was the way to do it? And I have to say, there still isn't a strong agreement how to do that, right? Different sets of my colleagues have different kinds of tools that they use to try to go forward. A lot of people working very closely in the microscope would still prefer to use LabVIEW, for example, this kind of graphical programming language, whereas other of my tool suite colleagues would still use MATLAB or Python. But I felt like in the case of the specific situation of being able to span quite large area from current hardware control to also just sheer number crunching, this was the language that led me to do all of that with one platform.
Right. Yeah, so you mentioned a couple of pearls there in the middle of this description. So there's the intense computation, which I believe Julia is really good at scaling up. So taking my algorithm from my laptop to a cluster is always a challenge in many other languages. You also called out something which I found interesting, that is Julia is written in Julia, right? Python, people say Python, but it's maybe NumPy, and that's C++. And it depends a little bit on which package you're using. And then when the language it improves, it doesn't mean that all the packages improve. So you're really much depending on the authors of specific packages. So that ecosystem is not as broad as you might think. And as the language evolves, you're not guaranteed things. But you also called out the capability of looking in and making your own pull request to the language, which is being part of the community, which is a nice feeling that people feel like they can contribute. And I guess based on where you work, that's part of your mission in life, right? How can you help others with your knowledge, right, at a faster and more interesting rate? And you also called out, I think, the REPL of how interesting that is, which often people, when they get started with Python, they have these concept of environments and they get a little confused, and adding in packages, there's multiple ways of doing it. And then the question is, what is the right way? It feels like often hurdles that domain experts probably just want to avoid. And at a certain moment, yeah, you make your peace with it. And I think you're moving on to the status quo is not good enough. What is that? And because you're in the place, you could trade it towards Julia, which is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. There's various things here, right? To be able to contribute to part back to a project, right? This is supposed to be part of open source, right? This is the idea is that not only am I sharing my code, but you can send me changes, right? And this goes way all the way back to something like the Linux kernel. But increasingly for science, this is also really important, because part of what you're supposed to be doing in science is not only telling people, kind of, these are my observations, my hypothesis, this is why my hypothesis was wrong or it seems to be right, but how did you get to those conclusions? What were your methods? And so you want to be able to also share your code so other people can see how you came to those conclusions. And yes, the thing is, even with MATLAB, I could do some open source in that I could share my code at least, right? And as long as you had a MATLAB license, you could run my code. But occasionally I found this shit where that wouldn't be possible. And so increasingly, I think other people have become to the conclusion that we should push open source further. And I think this was a big part of both the R and Python communities. They weren't necessarily using these because at the time when they started, that these were necessarily better, but they also wanted it to be freer and more transparent of how things were working. How did we get these conclusions? Because sometimes we can make mistakes, but sometimes we need to understand how the whole stack is working in order to understand how those conclusions were brought about, right? But there's another phenomenon there, right? It's just because something is open and there's a possibility of you contributing changes back, there's not necessarily the community that lets you provide that feedback, right? And so something I struggle with a little bit on the forums is that people will talk about the core Julia developers. And after I've been in the community, I think this becomes a really amorphous concept. Like, who are you talking about? Are you talking about Jeff or you? But I've also contributed code now to, Julia itself. So I'm a core developer. It's a little bit amorphous, right? And so I think even when the open source project is open, right, there's not necessarily that invitation for you, just some random person, to contribute, or that your changes will be recognized and evaluated. And it does affect the sociology a little bit. You have to understand how things work and what are people expecting in terms of how you describe a problem. But I think that's just part of open source experience.
Also in life, when you work in a company, you have to work with other people, right? And you need to understand the rules of the game.
Absolutely. And I think part of my experience was actually part of how I ended up having a lot of time to spend with Julia. I was also trying to learn the sociology of my new role of how do things work in this. And I was actually waiting for a few months on a pull request, I didn't realize I had to do a little bit more to get someone's attention because they didn't quite know how to efficiently process their GitHub notifications. So they had no idea I had made this pull request, right? Um, but from my perspective, I was looking here, I was like, okay, I made these two pull requests, one, for my job and one for Julia, and this Julia thing got handled first. So, I'll keep engaging on that while I'm waiting for for something to move there. So I think a really important thing about an open source project or something like that is not just posting it on GitHub, but also figuring out how to be responsive and give some people some feedback, because you give people some feedback, they will sometimes come back and they'll start collaborating with you. And that's where I think open source becomes really powerful. That's where, we're not just sharing what we're doing, but we're now collaborating towards a common goal of trying to advance a piece of software, make it work not just for me, but for everyone else. And I think that's a really beautiful thing at the end of the day when it does work well.
But that journey is not for everybody, right? So it takes a certain amount of curiosity. I guess you need to get your hands dirty at a certain moment. So I also looked at your GitHub account. You're active on a couple of projects, and you're also a maintainer of a few. And I think interpolations.jl, but and also HDF. Is the HDF5.jl, is this something related to your work, combining it with what you're talking with the microscopes and looking at data and then being able to minimize it, and then you can, as a standard, let's piggyback onto that? Is that how you became a maintainer of this project? And because you're a maintainer, that's where you picked up the tips and tricks of how to build a good ecosystem? Or were these things in a different order?
I think these are all related, right? Because in order to become a maintainer of a project, you need to understand a little bit about how the project works, but also for the language you're using, what are the standards of how to make a good package? What are the requirements there? For something like interpolations, it's a situation where there is a very experienced developer in the Julia community. This is Professor Tim Holy, who's a professor of neuroscience at Washington University, St. Louis. And I'm not sure how he has all this time to both be a full-time professor, run a neuroscience lab, and be a Julia developer, but he does this somehow. But this one instance, he was realizing that he created this package and he wanted to move on to think about other things. And so he was looking for a maintainer for this. I was very interested in interpolation. I think this comes from my interest in imaging and imaging science and all of that. And I realized that a lot of people around me think of images as just a bunch of pixels, and you assume you get this bunch of squares. But I realized that no, actually, you go back into the information theory, you read Claude Shannon's papers from Bell Labs. They actually were making this connection between this digital world and this analog world. And really, the way that you should think of an image is this smooth, continuous landscape where we just have some samples of what's happening in front of that. But you can connect these two worlds. These things are connected. And part of the way to connect them is through interpolation. So that's I had an interest in this. I had some knowledge about how interpolation works. And I also wanted to learn more about how you build a proper package. And so inheriting a package from someone very experienced seemed like a good way to start. And I definitely learned quite a bit from doing that. I had some maybe sessions on how should you run a Git repository, right? And in my scientific work, I don't like the idea of rewriting history, right? I like the idea of keeping an immutable logbook of what did I do from day to day. And the way I would try to usually maintain my Git repositories was just put the commits in as I had done them at the time, right? Not squashing them, not rebasing things. I do that. And eventually I got some feedback that, people didn't quite like how I was doing that. They couldn't quite see how the changes were happening at a high level. And so they really wanted me to squash a pull request, things like this. And, I eventually learned to adapt. Like, okay, I can do that. I can still go back and break out the visual commits if I needed to, and so forth. And so I think after I had gained that skill, I went back to a problem I was having back with the microscopes. And my job is we're trying to save all this data, these gigabytes per second, into some standard format, right? And not just any standard format, because we need to be able to look at these volumes of data, these 3D, 4D volumes over 3D over time, really, right? And it turns out it's really inefficient to be zoomed into some small part of the image, but having to load the entire XY plane in order to get to that next level. Okay. And so we needed a format that allowed us to look at chunks that had the same dimensionality of the data set we were dealing with. So if I had a 3D data set, I wanted to look at 3D sub volumes. So I could just load that part of the data that I'm trying to look at, not the whole XY plane, which would contain a whole bunch of things I don't want to look at.
Ah,
And
interesting.
it turned out that one of those formats that could deal with this is HF5, which is hierarchical data format version 5. And this is something that is pretty old in that it saw its genesis at the end of the 90s and it was really starting to build up in the 2000s and was mainly geared towards supercomputing applications. In fact, it came from a place not far from where I grew up in Illinois at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, NCSA. And so it can work for us, but there were some issues there in that there was a competing idea of how to deal with this, which is instead of putting all these subvolumes, these chunks in one big file, the group leader where I work at JLA at the Harkins Medical Institute, another idea is like, why don't we just put these chunks as individual files on a file system? The file system deal with where are these located, and then we could access these in the most simplest way that you could imagine, right? You just run a bunch of parallel processes. Each process deals with one chunk at a time, and you could distribute this very simply. Whereas with HF5, typically had to use some supercomputing technology called a message passing interface (MPI), which allow you to coordinate multiple processes in a very intricate dance in order to access data. But this problem is that neither of those descriptions actually were suitable for what we were doing, right? First of all, I needed this to be really simple and that I was just trying to get data off from the camera and save it, right? And then I needed to get that as quickly as possible to something so we could view the data and then eventually process it. And the problem is we were doing this on Windows. And it turns out creating a bunch of very small files on Windows is not something it's great at. It's actually not
Right.
optimized for scenario at all. A little bit better on Linux, but not so great on Windows. And we were doing this on Windows because the cameras had drivers for Windows, and that's how we knew how to rig the microscope together. And so I started looking into what was happening here. Why were neither of these scenarios working that well for me? So I eventually figured out what was making Windows slow and got into a little bit of hardware. It turned out some of our hardware was the way our hard drives were rigged into a RAID wasn't quite correct. Looked into some processors. It turns out having two processors in a server multi-socket configuration actually slowed down the memory quite a bit, which made saving a lot slower, which made compression a lot slower. And so there's all kinds of things. And throughout this, what I was so super impressed by was that Julia was letting me get down to lowest levels at times, figure out, oh yeah, the memory is slow, right? I would have never been able to figure that out in either MATLAB or Python. I was just too far away from the lower calls. But with Julia, I could very quickly go in and say, okay, how fast is a BEM copy? And then do this. Actually, experiment back on my laptop and realizing, hey, my laptop is actually faster than this CL processor, these dual socket CL processors. What is happening? And then, I understood there was some technology called NUMA. I eventually took all that knowledge and made another Julia package called, I think, array allocators, which allows you to be a little bit more careful about how you're allocating memory, whether it's associated with one processor or another one. And that allows you to do all kinds of tricks to make that kind of thing more efficient. But yeah, I think I was finding with Julia is that I had the tools to figure out the problem because I could both use high level code, but also get into the really low level code and talk to the operating system and make those fine measurements of the object to see how was my computer working.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in my prior experience, I usually would hit a wall because there would be some point where I just couldn't go any further in MATLAB or Python, right? I would have to change what I was doing. I would have to write a MEX file. I would have to switch to Python or something like that. And even
recompile
then, it was
something and it doesn't
you
quite
had to compile something. It was a completely different workflow from what I was doing before, right? On the other hand, I could do this very efficiently in just Julia, which was great for exploration, for just learning how things were working and understanding of how does my computer working. And so I think this is a big realization for me of like happening in front of me.
Right.
And I was in the business of being in rather extreme situations. I had a lot of data to deal with in a scientific application on a complicated, expensive instrument.
Right. Can you maybe tell me a little bit more about this HDF5 community and maybe to contrast it, how different or how similar it is with the Julia community?
Sure. HTML5 stands for Hardware Data Format version 5. And this is a format meant for scientific data. Actually, at JuliaCon, I'm going to be hosting a scientific data mini symposium. Although I'm actually not talking too much. I already gave this talk last year. But I think it very much intersects with the Julia community in many ways, in that both communities are very concerned about high performance computing and scientific computing. And so we have a lot of interest and there's a lot of interaction between our communities. And I think one of the earliest interactions was to try to make these two things work together, to make Julia work together with HF5. And some of the frustration initially was just building HF5 and distributing it with Julia. So at some point, someone early on in the Julia community actually really reverse engineered HF5, and it wasn't really hard because the spec is open. But they wrote a version Julia package that would write an HF5 file, but they read the whole thing in Julia itself. And this became the JLD2 package, whereas and just like Julia data, that's what JLD stands for. And the JLD1 package was actually just a wrapper around the C library. There's actually a wrapper around the HF5.jl package, which wraps the C library. And so we are having problems trying to figure out how to compile this. So something that we like to do for binary packages outside of Julia is to do cross compilation, because this makes our life easier in terms of how do we distribute things. So we could have one build script that would build for Windows, Mac OS, Linux. Doesn't matter whether you're using Intel processors or ARM processors or Apple M1 chip. We have one script to build them all. That's how we like to build things in Julia, because Julia also works on all these platforms. And we had a hard time doing this with HF5 for a very long time, because a lot of what HF5 was doing a bunch of checks to see, does this computing platform work with floating point numbers the way that program expects it to? And that's understandable, because HF5 had to run on a lot of different hardware decades ago. And that's when things weren't quite as standardized as they are now. But it turns out this is a little bit, doesn't quite meet the realities of today, that you don't really have to do this anymore, right? But this was still doing it. And this created a problem for us, because that meant it had to run these test programs on the actual platforms that we were targeting. And so eventually I started taking the skills I learned from interacting with Julia's community and started using that to interact with the HF5 community, trying to figure out how they talk to each other. And it helped also that they were migrating in my direction as well. They started using GitHub more, and so we could use GitHub issues to point out problems. And I think as they did that, so I started also fixing things over there, right? So I found problems with documentation or even the C code that needs change. And eventually I wasn't just one person of many that were interested in kind of the interaction between Julia and HF5. And eventually I started talking to folks over in the HF group, and they made a change, right? They made a successful change that would now allow us to do this cross compilation that matches the way that we pop other packages. And so in Julia, the binary builder ecosystem today, you will find many copies of HF5 or many different platforms. I think it's actually more platforms than the HF group officially supports and distributes themselves. And so I think this is kind of a really fun thing for me, is just being able to learn from the Julia community and bring that to another community and then improve the interaction of these two things. I think that was really fun for me. And that also actually helped me with my work because it made it easier to reconcile these different data formats we were using. As I mentioned before, we usually deal with chunks, and we like those smaller chunks to represent the dimensionality of kind of the larger data set as a whole, so that I could load specifically the data that I want. But there were two different ways of doing things: either putting things in a large file or putting a lot of small files on the file system. And something I came to realize is that a lot of the problem that we had with putting a lot of chunks in the same file, is that we usually need to use a complicated library to get to data in the first place. But eventually what I realized is that this wasn't necessarily the case, that if I could get the library to just tell me where the data is, that I could get to the data more easily in parallel if I needed to. And so this basically broke down a lot of technical issues that were preventing us from doing this, which meant that using this knowledge, I could now reconcile all these problems I was having, that I could, from my very fancy microscopes, save a lot of high-dimensional, large volume data into a single file and be able to access that data efficiently without having to break them up into very small files that would break windows.
So maybe just to make sure that I understand you and following you. So the HDF5, what makes it special is it's not, I don't know, like a MAT file or some kind of binary file that you just store data and it's compressed. There's a whole bunch of metadata associated with it, right? And it's that metadata structure architecture which allows you to zoom in to data in a different manner. So I think historically, like an image, it's like a matrix with 3 dimensions or maybe 4 or whatnot. And there's always this issue of it's stored by column or row major in different architectures. And every time you want to zoom into a square, there's a whole bunch of indexing, but you still need to load the whole thing in memory, right? And there's the whole idea of HDF5 that it enables you, just by parsing the metadata, that you can zoom in to that square without having to load everything. And you can do this parallelly because you've defined exactly where all this is. Is that kind of the idea behind this?
Roughly. So HDF5 allows you to store your data in chunks. And so that's a little bit better than, say, just a TIFF file for an image, in that TIFF file only allows you to create 2D tiles. But now I can store my data in subvolumes in 3D chunks. And this is really critical for a really efficient volume viewer, and that I don't have to load this whole XY plane in order to just look at this small part of my data. And for a scientific application, this is critical because now I can efficiently get to some small part of the data that actually contains either the cell that I want to look at or where the organism might be. Whereas otherwise, I would have to load the whole plane, and often I don't care about this corner because it's just noise over there. So this very efficiently allows me to get to the part of the data that I'm interested in. It's funny you mentioned MAT files because actually a later version of MAT file in 2017, I think MATLAB 2017 plus a MAT file, if you choose that option, will also be the HDF5 file.
Interesting.
And so it's actually, an HDF5 is meant to be a generic container for things, and you're supposed to be able to store things in nested folders as well, but it's all contained in a file. It's mainly meant for saving things or interchange. But it turns out another part of the complication here is that we also have cloud computing, right?
Okay.
And so we have services like Amazon S3, which allows you to break your data to buckets and to key value stores. And doesn't quite work with HDF5 quite natively. And so other people have come up with a different kind of data format called ZAR, which is very similar in ways to HDF5, in that it has hierarchies and allows you to create n-dimensional chunks so you can access the subvolumes of your data that you're interested in. Although typically it's done the thing that breaks windows, which is creates lots of small little files. And which is not a problem for, say, Amazon S3, but it is a problem if you're sitting next to a microscope with a Windows computer. And I always had to reconcile these things. One thing that then SAR eventually came around to doing in that SAR B3 is they created shards where we now take those chunks and put them back into one big file. But this is a little bit confusing because it sounded like we're going around and there's a fundamental problem with storing many chunks in one big file that we were going to make the same mistakes. But eventually what I realized is that the problem really was more of the library that was being used to access those chunks, right? Because so fundamentally, I think SAR tries to maybe make things very simple, sometimes too simple, right? And just define the format and allow for many implementations.
I see.
But basically, eventually, by digging both the HF5 and thinking about how do we do this in SAR, was able to reconcile the two and realize that this wasn't a fundamental problem, that you could both do both approaches efficiently, and it was just a matter of making the information available. So on the HF5 side, I was able to work with them to figure out how do I efficiently extract the information about where the chunks are in the file so I could read them correctly if I needed to, or decompress them in parallel if I needed to, which is something that HF5 currently does not let you do. It doesn't let you do thread parallel things through the C library, but you can through Julia. On the kind of other aspects, we came up, on the SAR side, we came up with a way to store that exact same kind of information, like where are the chunks and how big are they? The only difference that instead of having to walk through a few different metadata trees within a file, we just put all the data at the end so it's easily accessible and you know exactly where to find that. And eventually, I think other people caught on to that. We have a few different partners in that. For example, there's folks at Google Brain that are really interested in this problem as well. And they need an efficient way to store both data for machine learning and for this data on brains, frankly, that we also work at my institute. And it turns out that we both need a sort of really similar format. And so I think being able to understand how communities work and be able to walk between communities and also figure out to interface with them allows you to really make things better for everyone
Right.
at the end of the day, sometimes whether they know it or not. And hopefully, I think with some of these things, I'm hoping something like MATLAB gets better as well. And I think everyone has this problem. We all have data. We want to be able to access it efficiently. I think maybe the only thing that's a little bit different than the data I usually work with is that it usually has this higher dimensionality or this different relationship with each other that I can't quite put it into, say, a 2D table with rows and columns.
Right.
And I think that's the main thing that differentiates scientific data from data that.
Yeah. But you could maybe make the argument that tables is existed for a long time, and adding in another dimension is not a bad idea generally. So you're spearheading what probably the future looks like, right?
Absolutely. The thing is, you can always reduce everything down to a table. The problem is that it's just not the most efficient, right? So I could take my n-dimensional data, flatten it out to a one-dimensional array, and then sort it together with the x, y, and z coordinates of every point. But that's not the most efficient, right?
Right.
That would be 4 times the size of my data. And when I'm dealing with terabytes and petabytes, that's a big problem.
Yeah.
That also messes up with how I can access the data, because I usually just want, again, local chunks.
Yeah.
Right. That are the same dimensionality of my bigger data set. And so I think this is becoming a problem not only just for scientists like me, it's becoming also a problem now for people doing machine learning, because they usually have these very high dimensional weights that control how these AI models work.
Mm.
And it's no surprise that there's a Google package down called TensorStore that allows you to basically access this kind of multidimensional chunk data in an efficient way. Although I'm realizing as I say this that something I'm going to have to do very soon is figure out how to package this for Julia. So stay tuned.
So then maybe to take a step back so you are indeed in a unique situation, or unique. You iterated towards a job that you did not study for, which is an interesting thing, and you went on a very interesting journey. But as a maintainer of these Julia packages, You've learned a lot about the ecosystem. Do you have some wisdom for those who are trying to get started to join this journey of helping with the open source community based on your experience with HDF5?
Yeah, I think the first thing, this applies to much of my life, is to figure out what actually motivates you, right? Is what is the thing that drives you at the end of the day? Because if you don't quite understand that, you're going to have a hard time understanding what is your role here. And part of why there seems to be this economy of what I do and what I study is I figured out very quickly early in my life that doing stuff with computers, computing, and programming, these are things that I was self-motivated with, right? That I could teach myself how to do very easily, that I had fun learning. Whereas these other these are things I was interested in, but couldn't necessarily teach myself to do them without working with other people. And so this is how I chose my course of study, right? I concentrated and majored in fields that I was interested in, but I needed someone else to help mentor me, to help teach me the field, right? Whereas I knew I could do this computing thing, that I could like writing programs, that I liked picking up a book and reading about abstract data types. And this is something that I enjoyed, so I could do that myself. I could teach myself these things.
Right.
And for an open source contributor, you have to understand what is your role, right? Do you like testing things? Maybe just like trying a bunch of cool things. And so then what I would recommend in that case is that you learn to be really good at writing up bug reports and trying to get the details there, because you might not know how to fix them. But if you can convey enough details about a problem to someone who knows how to fix them, then that makes their job a lot easier.
Right.
Or maybe something that you really like is writing. If you like writing, there's a huge role for someone to have to write documentation or really clearly putting together a tutorial on how to do something. And so I think the thing is, there's so many ways to contribute to open source, not just code. Sometimes I found a lot of the work I've done at Julia is reading something, realizing that doesn't quite make sense with my understanding of how this works, and then trying to reconcile that, either make Julia work in the way that I think it should, or change the documentation to better describe how it is working. And sometimes I go both ways. It's okay, there's options A and B. We can either change the documentation or we could change the code. And at times, if I have enough time, I'll actually submit both and give the people who know better or have a vision for the future of Julia to pick one of those two, right?
Right.
And that's fine, right? And I know there's other things that are just more complicated to deal with, right? There's dependencies upon dependencies. And so I think, first of all, understanding kind of the bigger picture of what's going on in a project, where's the project going, to realize that people are trying to make this thing smaller, and then trying to adapt your goals. I want my programs to be faster. So what do I need to do to make my programs faster? And then what am I waiting on to allow that to happen? And so I think it's part of this is asking the right questions, finding the right communication channels. I found that for Julia, being on the Julia Slack is a really fast way to learn, because there's a lot of people who will help you, who will answer your questions, and more importantly, correct you when you're wrong. I think there's an old meme of how to use the internet is the fastest way to get the correct answer to state the wrong one. And it's definitely been the case. I would try to answer questions myself. Sometimes I would still be wrong and people would still correct me. But from doing that, I learned a whole bunch of things about Julia language and the right way to do things.
So it's interesting the way that you articulated that, Mark. So you went through this phase of journey of different languages, different issues, different walls that you jumped over. And then you reinforced several times in this conversation that the community is a key component of that. So having a group of people who are there to support you plays a role in you feeling part of something, but support also is being true and helping you, right? So I think the technical community is one of the driving forces, people who are more knowledgeable about a topic than yourself, telling you or teaching you, mentoring you, and you being able to receive that feedback, right? So being able to receive it and give it, that is where this collaboration really accelerate things. And it's a foundational part of the ecosystem, which is you're not decoupled from each other because you're programming C, Rust, or Python and merging it all together. No, you're all in the same both, and that enables people to be more productive and strongly collaborating. And then you then learn the ropes by creating your own package and learning the right way, making some mistakes along the way. But that's perfectly fine. And it's not just about the code. Also, I also often hear people say, I don't know where to get started. Documentation, examples, these are really easy things to get going. But this whole discussion is a topic about building a Julia ecosystem. And a part of collaborating is, pull requests, communicating, Slack, that's all great. But every now and again, you need to get together, right? If I would like to join this community, what advice would you give? Is there specific conferences? Are there meetups? Tell me a little bit more of what is the right way to feel this magic in person.
Conference post-pandemic. So I started using Julia in 2020, and pandemic, there were no in-person conferences for 3 years, I think. And we had our first one last year in 2023 at MIT, back where Julia started. And now the second conference, we're coming back to Europe. And you had the crazy idea of hosting this conference in a football stadium. It took me a while to understand why we were doing this and what was the attraction of the football stadium. But I realized that a football stadium is really good at accommodating a large number of people. They have meeting rooms, they have catering services, they have turnstiles to basically make sure people can get in and out. And I think it turns out this looks like just the right fit for where the Julia community is at the moment. And besides a lot of folks in our community being really excited about the venue of being in a football stadium, a soccer stadium for my American friends and listeners, I think there's just a lot of enthusiasm for also where we're going here. Part of why we've come to Eindhoven is because we've had some very motivated folks from up to our company, ASML, use Julia. And so we are recognizing that this is coming from some place that we need to go there to both recognize this community, but also take advantage of the enthusiasm that they're building around them. And so, this is really exciting. Now, I think that said, there are these smaller meetups that are occurring. Our fiscal sponsor for the Julia open source project is NumFocus. They also sponsor PyData, which is a focus that focuses a little bit more on the Python ecosystem, but also has been open to Julia talks in the past as well. And so we've usually gone to those to introduce Julia and talk to people about how they can integrate Julia through the workflows, not just necessarily Python. It's more about numerical processing of data. And we're definitely connected with that community as well. And so I think what's really interesting about what we're doing in Eindhoven is that we combine these events, that we recognize that these two communities need to talk to each other and have some shared interests. And in the same venue, we're doing both a PyData Eindhoven and the JuliaCon Global at the same time. I think locally, I've occasionally find opportunities to connect with kind of other Julia enthusiasts in where I live, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C. And so we occasionally met up, say, in the D.C. metropolitan area, either out in the suburbs or sometimes downtown itself. And just things are actually also different. I feel that some people are questioning, do we actually need to be in the same space sometimes? And I very much think that we do. There's certain kinds of casual conversations, indirect happenstance that occurs at a conference when you just sit down at a table and you start coding and someone else is right next to you and says, hey, that's really interesting. Maybe we could work together, right? And that's kind of thing that you can't quite do on Zoom or Teams or Skype, right? You can't just nudge over the guy that's next to you in the screen and say, hey, what are you doing with that? And so I think that there's definitely the need for this kind of interaction, I think. And trying to figure out how to do that, I think, has been a really interesting part of my journey as I've gone further and further to Julia, both in terms of language, but in terms of community as well.
So then maybe just if I understand that correctly, so you're saying that this conference, the JuliaCon 2024, this is going to be in a football stadium in the city of Eindhoven, so in the Netherlands. But can you describe to me what type of conference? How big is this?
Sure. Yeah, we're talking probably around 700 people. That's been the target that we've been aiming at. The last conference at MIT, we were aiming for 500 people, and I think including all the online attendees, we ended up around 670 people, and maybe just a little bit over 500 in physical attendance. And so we're talking about 700 people at this conference. Part of why we've raised our expectations here is because we've seen a lot of engagement from the local community. There's been prior meetups for a kind of local conference that's by itself attracted 300 people. And realizing that we're both going to have a global audience and a local audience at this conference has been really motivating how we're planning for this current one. And as I mentioned, we're also trying to be very inclusive about this in many ways, right? We're having a Pi Data conference there, so you don't have to love Julia. You could talk about Python, but there, and we very much appreciate the conversation. As I mentioned, I work with several different languages, and having that cross-language conversation is important to realize what's better on the other side and how can I make my language better in this regard.
Or even deepen your understanding, right? So it's not necessarily only about how to make your language better, but understanding how other people do the same thing maybe solidifies your understanding of the language where you're more familiar in, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is, I'm hoping that we can get a slightly different audience here. I think we're in North America in a really pretty expensive city, frankly. And yeah, I can understand that it was difficult for some people to get there to attend that conference. And so I'm hoping that now being in Europe with a certain venue, with different kinds of options of how to get there to attend, that we're going to be able to bring in more people from different parts of the world, not just Europe, but also from Africa, the Middle East as well, Eastern Europe. And I think something that's really impressive to me when I went to go visit you in Eindhoven is how well connected via train this place that we're hosting conference is, right? I think you told me that this place, technically the stadium even has its own train stop, although that's only used for batches. But I think even having that is really interesting that the train is that close to the stadium that we could do this. Yeah. This is a little bit foreign concept, honestly, to me as a North American. This is having these kind of really close train connections is something I usually cannot rely on, but I'm really looking forward to seeing how well that works. I think it's going to be great. I'm also really hoping that it provides some opportunity for people just to commute to the conference, right? Not necessarily having to stay in Eindhoven, but be able to maybe just visit for a day. And I'm hoping that makes the conference more accessible.
So it's about an hour and a half from Amsterdam. So you can, if you fly to Amsterdam, one train, then you're at the venue in Eindhoven for JuliaCon. And if I understand correctly, the scope, you said about 700 people, and you're having a Pi Data conference associated with it. But how many speakers are we talking? Parallel tracks?
Yeah, we've broken records for how many proposals that we usually have set. I think we're looking at least 300 speakers with about 330 proposals last time I checked. And something that we really like to do with the global conference is to make this a really high participation conference. And so you can just do the math there. 700 attendees and 330 people giving some kind of presentation. That's a very high participation rate for a conference like this.
Right.
Often tech conferences are things you just go learn about things, but this is very much a conference that we want people to participate in. And I think that goes back to that community thing that we talked about earlier, right? This is something Julia is very much designed in a way that it made for you to participate in. And I think the conference is reflective of that as well. We'll see. I think my experience with trying to do this is that you cannot see everything at the conference. You have to pick and choose, but that means that everything is really interesting all the time. But at the same time, something else that we're doing here is we record all these talks and try to make as much of this available online as possible. It takes a few weeks to get everything online, but you can see how past JuliaCons went in the past by just going to our YouTube channel. I think you look up Julia Programming Language and you'll find our channel there. And you can view our talks. Unfortunately, you can't quite capture the full experience, those things that happen after the talks end and everyone floods into hallways. And we talked about how great that was. So we can't quite get the camera crews all the way around everywhere, but you can get some part of the experience and you can see the part of the joy that people have.
So Mark, it seems that you're very knowledgeable about this JuliaCon. What exactly is your role in this?
Yeah, starting with the 2023 conference, I volunteered for the role of financial chair, which means that I'm the person that is overseeing all financial matters with the conference. This both involves sponsorships, so that's usually asking companies or sometimes individuals to just give us funds to help us pay for the conference in exchange for some recognition. And that helps them to build their brand, help getting their name of their startup out, or just showing that they're a company that cares about this kind of thing and is interested in reaching these developers. This also involves dealing with ticketing, um, and making sure that we both are able to pay for the conference, have a little bit of money left over to help also fund the community at large, but also manage to get so that people who otherwise struggle to come to a conference like this can. So this involves trying to figure out, can we do some financial aid? Can we give away some amount of free tickets? Or can we help students attend a conference like this? This, from my experience, would really impact, their futures, right? I think when you're trying to figure out what you like, being able to attend a conference like this will really help you decide, is Julia for you or not? And so, this is, again, another one of the situations where I saw that they needed someone, and I just happened to see that and raised my hand, said, I know how to do this from some prior nonprofit work I had done. And I came into this, and now I'm helping to organize the conference. But to be honest, there's nothing really that special about me. It's just something that I happen to volunteer to do. And if anyone else would like to get more involved with organizing ChiliCon, there's plenty of room to do that in various different capacities.
Nice. So I guess that if anyone wants to meet you in person, that would be a good place to go, is to come to Eindhoven in July 2024. But are there other ways that people can reach out to you? So you've shared a lot of interesting stories. What is the right way for people to reach out to you and ask more questions if they have some?
I think maybe I spend quite a bit of time between Slack and Discourse these days in terms of my online Julia presence. I'm going to be at JuliaCon in Eindhoven this July, so I hope to meet many people there. I'm coming a little bit early, staying a little bit late, just to have some extra time to talk to people. Otherwise, I'm in the DC area. I'm not far from some major airports. If you're always in the area, let me know one way or the other, and we can figure out how to meet.
This is a great place to stop this episode. I hope it triggered your curiosity in some shape or form of how MATLAB, Python, or Julia are actually used in the real world. If you did find it interesting, just subscribe in your favorite podcast player. And while you're at it, write a review, as this will help the podcast going strong. In addition to that, don't be shy, share it with a couple of friends, as who knows, one of them might be a future guest on Inspiring Computing. Thank you.